Coming up on 101 West. 1 year ago, a freight train hauling toxic chemicals derailed in East Palestine. Officials decided to burn the chemicals, followed by a year-long cleanup effort. While a rail safety bill was proposed, does it have the language for real change? Why is the industry against more safety regulation? Tonight, 21 News asks the question, are we any safer? We sit down with the head of the agency responsible for recommending rail safety changes and see what she says needs to be done. 101 West starts right now.
Good evening. Welcome to 101 West, a new program produced right here at 101 West Boardman Street. That's the locally owned studios of WFMJ since 1953. This news program goes deep into the issues facing the Youngstown Warren region. Tonight, we take that a step further and look into an important issue facing people in the valley as well as people across the country, rail safety. This Saturday marks 1 year since thousands of people living in East Palestine were awakened by knocks on their doors and told to evacuate on a bitterly cold winter night. The East Palestine train derailment, the burn-off, the promises, the health concerns, leading us to look deeper into whether that derailment led to any real change in rail safety. But first, we walk you through the events that led to the February 3rd, 2023 derailment aboard train 32N, also known as 32 Nasty. Here's Matt Stone.
A Norfolk Southern train left Madison, Illinois at 6:23 p.m., heading to Conway, Pennsylvania, a small community about 20 miles northeast of Pittsburgh. Train 32N was more than 1 3/4 miles long, consisting of 149 rail cars and 3 engines. The train weighed 18,000 tons and hauled 20 hazardous material tank cars. The train was reportedly called 32 Nasty by rail workers for alleged concerns over the length and weight of the train. Employees said the train had broken down once before arriving in East Palestine. Heat detectors indicated the temperature of the wheel bearings began to rise in Sebring at 7:47 and were rapidly rising when it went through Salem at 8:11. That's when fire could be seen under the train. By the time the train entered the village of East Palestine at 8:53, the crew attempted to stop it, but it was too late. 38 train cars had derailed, including 11 tank cars carrying hazardous materials. The derailment resulted in a fire and controlled burn of known carcinogenic chemicals. It was an event that uprooted the small town and caused an economic upheaval for lots of homeowners and businesses. Toxins seeped into the environment throughout the village. Saturday marks 1 year later, begging the question, are we any safer?
In this 101 West Watchdog investigation, we look to answer that question. We found there hasn't been any new rail safety regulation mandated in the year since the derailment, and any changes to improve safety are either stalled or put into effect on a voluntary basis for the rail companies to decide whether to implement. Madison Tromler now on why rail safety seems to be going nowhere.
Trains transport just about everything on more than 140,000 miles of track across the United States. Class 1 trains travel further distances with fewer stops, a crucial means of transportation run by private companies with a revenue of more than $24 billion a year. Nearly half of the U.S. population lives within 2 miles of a major rail line. An average of 857 major trains derail a year nationwide. Most are not deadly, but depending on timing, location, and what's inside the train, the impact could be catastrophic. That's because trains are required to transport hazardous materials. While no one died in East Palestine, derailments in recent decades have killed hundreds.
So right now we're in a period of pretty flat safety performance, roughly speaking, beginning in about 2010.
Since the February East Palestine train derailment, federal rail safety legislation has been proposed but not passed. There's no doubt the toxic train disaster here in East Palestine shed a renewed light on rail safety, resulting in the 7 major rail companies making some changes. But are they enough? Are we safer today?
We haven't seen the specific evidence of that yet. We know from anecdotal evidence that there's still pockets of real problems out there. One of the things that I think it's important to recognize is that it takes time to effect change. I think a number of undertakings have been made by the railroads that could contribute to an improvement in the situation. There are many statements been made at the chief executive level indicating refocus on safety and service.
I reached out to all 7 rail companies on what specific changes they've made within the past year. Companies, including Norfolk Southern, say they've added more frequent, updated Hotbox detectors. These devices are used to assess railcar components and their temperatures, including axles, brakes, and bearings. A failed wheel bearing is the preliminary cause of the East Palestine derailment. Rail company CSX says it's working to install more Hotbox detectors that are about 14.5 miles apart. Ohio passed a bill in March requiring detectors to be 10 to 15 miles apart. That measure has stalled after a rail industry lobbyist group filed a lawsuit before it took effect. But would those standards have even helped in East Palestine? There were 3 detectors within 30 miles. So what was the threshold for taking action? The train's wheel bearing temperature showed an increase during the first 2 detections, but not enough to trigger an alarm and stop the train under Norfolk Southern standards. The detectors measured 38 degrees. 10 miles later, 103 degrees. No alerts. It wasn't until 20 miles later there was an alert. By that time, the temperature had reached 253 degrees, but it was too late. You can see in the moments before the derailment, flames underneath the rail car. That means when the temperature had increased by 171%, no action was required. Norfolk Southern standards do not warrant a stop and inspection unless the temperature reaches at least 170 degrees. Similar to Norfolk Southern, CSX says crews stop the train when a Hotbox detector reads 170 degrees or higher. The company did add a new threshold as of November, where any temperature reading above 135 degrees triggers an alert to dispatchers, but does not warrant a stop unless it's deemed necessary. Since the derailment, Norfolk Southern has expanded a regional initiative to train first responders.
It's going to be on this property.
With plans to place a facility in East Palestine.
Responders can work on actual real trains.
Grady Cawthon and Stephen Dittmeyer are retired executives of the Federal Railroad Administration and have an extensive career in rail spanning decades, including the research and development of rail safety standards. They've worked on both sides of the regulation. Cawthon says there has been a notable increase in hiring rail workers after added stress was put on employees during COVID, but says more needs to be done.
Particularly in the operating crafts, that would be conductors, locomotive engineers, ground employees who work in the yards, those kind of folks. That hiring has been notable. We have not seen effort to bring in more mechanical employees. Fixing cars doesn't appear to be a very profitable line of work for the railroads.
So what's been addressed on Capitol Hill? U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown and J.D. Vance have introduced the Railway Safety Act of 2023. While that bill would increase some fines and expand training, it leaves most of the regulation up to the Secretary of Transportation to write at a later date. The bill is stalled due to gridlock on Capitol Hill.
Since the East Palestine derailment, the major rail companies all agreed to join a system that allows railroads and their employees to anonymously report close calls. 1 year later, none have joined. So what would it take for major change to happen? Congress has the power to implement or update rail safety laws, while the FRA has the power to enforce them. So why don't they? It's complicated. The FRA, along with other agencies, can write rail safety regulations. But to quote Schoolhouse Rock, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. The process can be slow, with multiple steps, including informing the public, a public comment period, and evaluations looking at environmental or economic concerns. The other government agency that looks at rail safety, the National Transportation Safety Board, is limited to recommendations only. In other words, it can recommend changes to Congress and the FRA, but the NTSB has no power to make rules of its own. That power lies with Congress.
FRA has authority under the legislation that created the agency, and then there have been various safety laws written over time. And generally speaking, FRA has said we cannot initiate new regulations without some authority from Congress. There seem to be attempts to keep FRA's size small. They don't want to get FRA into dispatching of trains or into control of car fleets and so on. There's just sort of an ingrained thing in Congress.
The last major rail safety bill to pass was in 2008, after deadly train accidents between 2002 and 2007. It was the first to pass since 1994. An effort to regulate hazardous waste on railways died in committee in 2015. Now, why is Congress so slow to act? Senators and representatives often receive donations from multi-billion-dollar rail companies for their campaigns. Take that 2008 law, for example. We followed the money and found that the bill did pass, but not before the rail industry tried to influence it. When the bill was first proposed, lobbyists increased spending by more than 18% that year alone. Then, in the 6 years following, nearly $263 million was spent to prevent changes. Also to note, many of the key provisions in this bill would not go into effect for years to come.
Any new regulation gets fought by the railroads, and they are a big lobby, and they have big lobbying funds because they are so profitable.
It's always difficult to get things regulated. As a lifelong regulator, I can affirm that to you. It's even more so today, probably, with the influence of money in politics. There are very few lobbyists who spend much time on rail safety from the point of view of the public interest.
Coffin says a deeply regulated rail industry is not the answer either. It's important to note the industry has been deregulated since 1980 and able to largely set its safety standards. During this time, the numbers show train derailments are down from nearly 7,000 in 1980. And the experts say it's because when they make more money, they can invest in safety.
And we haven't seen the continued improvements that the implementation of technology, which the railroads tout quite proudly and justifiably. We haven't seen the effects of that.
Another reason for the resistance of regulation is that technology still costs money.
The railroads are such an important part of the national transportation system. They carry bulk commodities that nobody else carries. They do a terrific job every day, normally handling hazardous material shipments that we don't want on the highway. They hold down costs for everybody concerned, delivering feedstocks, fertilizers, grain, everything we need for our everyday lives and for our industries. It's critical that they be permitted to do it well.
Major derailments also cost millions of dollars. So might a long-term investment in safety be what's needed?
That's real money for even highly profitable railroads.
There's a cost to implement these, but it's going to improve your profitability even further, and it's going to make your customers happy.
Dittmeyer says there are automated technologies that exist to make emergency situations like walking to track down a hot wheel bearing across a miles-long train far more efficient. He says the rail companies are not using this technology enough.
You can track trains in real time, and you can forecast when arrival time's better because you have the real-time information on where they are and how fast they're going and so on. But they've never integrated these systems.
Cawthon has done research on another unregulated safety component, how trains are organized. A train can be impacted by factors like weight, length, and terrain. He believes Congress should mandate rail companies to pay more attention to train makeup.
A number of the other derailments that have occurred out there over the last several years were caused by train makeup, and that needs to be addressed, even if it hasn't been the cause of a massive release of hazardous materials.
While only 13% of cars on the East Palestine train carried hazardous materials, they were mostly clustered together, maximizing the impact when they derailed. Earlier this year, the FRA called for railroads to reevaluate their placement of rail cars.
They know how to do it right. It takes more time and more people to build the train correctly than just throw it together and get the heck out of town. Commitments required. And my thesis has been the Federal Railroad Administration needs to sit on them and make sure that they're doing what they know they should be doing. And I think there would, in most cases, be very little dispute about what they should be doing. The railroads know better.
Cawthon and Dittmeyer say there could and should be stronger rail safety mandates, better enforcement, and a push for compliance. Currently, the maximum fines for violations are just over $232,000. In 2022, Norfolk Southern was fined 74 times, totaling a little more than $500,000. In that same year, the company had profits of $8.65 billion.
2024 may bring even more hurdles for new regulation. Cawthon says if these were easy issues, they'd be taken care of yesterday. And what makes it even more challenging is if a new administration comes along.
We lose something when we have an administration, as we did in the prior administration, that is anti-regulatory. There are a lot of impediments that are put in the way of regulation because you know you're going to get sued if you issue a regulation that industry really doesn't like. And what you'd like to do is you'd like to issue a regulation that's effective, enforceable, administrable, and tolerable by the people who have to carry it out.
As Madison referenced, the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, can only make recommendations when it comes to transportation safety. These are the experts with boots on the ground who are sent out to determine the cause of significant accidents. Yet the NTSB cannot put in place any changes to rail safety regulations. Jennifer Homendy is the chair of the NTSB. She recently sat down with Madison and was quite blunt about her frustrations.